It was during the late autumn of 2018 when I found myself driving alone through a particularly isolated stretch of rural Nebraska, well past midnight, under a vast and indifferent sky that seemed to press down heavier with every passing mile. I had chosen to avoid the interstate due to a series of overnight construction delays I had encountered earlier in the evening, opting instead for a state highway that, while poorly lit and unfamiliar, promised a more direct path toward my destination. Or at least, it had seemed that way at the time. The road I was on was the kind that seems to have been forgotten by both modern infrastructure and human presence, bordered only by long, unbroken expanses of open fields and the occasional derelict structure, their skeletal forms barely visible through the darkness. There were no service stations, no signs of habitation, and no cell signal to speak of. Just the steady, low hum of my car engine and the distant, rhythmic whisper of the wind threading its way through the roadside grass. As the minutes dragged into hours, I began to notice the subtle effects of fatigue setting in. My eyes growing heavy, my grip on the steering wheel loosening slightly, and the road ahead seeming to blur into a single, endless stretch of pale asphalt. It was during this haze of mental drift that I first noticed something unusual in the distance. Two small, flickering orange lights pulsing at regular intervals against the pitch-black backdrop of the empty road ahead. Initially, I assumed it was a vehicle with its hazard lights on, perhaps a stranded motorist who had pulled off onto the shoulder due to engine trouble or a flat tire. And though I was tired, the thought of passing by without at least assessing the situation gave me pause. As I drew closer, however, a strange feeling settled in my chest, one of vague but undeniable unease, the kind that builds slowly, without explanation, until it wraps itself around your instincts and tugs them tight. When I was finally within 100 feet of the vehicle, I could make out its shape more clearly. A compact silver sedan parked at a slight angle toward the drainage ditch, with its rear driver's side door ajar and the trunk completely closed. What struck me as immediately off-putting was the presence of a man standing well away from the vehicle, not by the open door or the hood where one would typically expect someone to be during a mechanical emergency, but instead positioned strangely close to the edge of the road, roughly 15 or 20 feet from the car, where he stood motionless, with one arm raised in a slow, measured wave. There was no urgency in the way he moved, no signs of panic or distress on his posture, and he made no attempt to step toward the road or flag me down in the typical frantic manner of someone in genuine need of assistance. Rather, his presence felt deliberately placed, as though he wanted to be noticed but not approached. And the longer I looked, the more unnatural it all began to feel. Instinctively, I eased off the accelerator, not coming to a complete stop, but slowing enough to shift into the opposite lane, giving the scene a wide berth as I passed. It was during this cautious maneuver that I saw what would permanently shift my perception from suspicion to dread. Two additional figures, previously unseen, emerging silently from behind the rear of the parked vehicle, their movements too fluid and synchronized to be accidental, as if they had been waiting for the precise moment I reached them before making their presence known. Both individuals appeared to be dressed in dark clothing, their silhouettes nearly indistinguishable against the night. And while I could not make out their facial features in the dim light, their body language communicated neither distress nor curiosity. They did not speak, did not wave, and made no effort to approach the car or the man who continued to stand by the roadside, but instead remained perfectly still, watching me with an eerie, focused stillness that sent a sharp, unmistakable signal to the more primal part of my brain. There was no question in my mind at that point that something was terribly wrong, and before I could fully articulate the threat in my own thoughts, my foot had slammed down on the gas pedal with a force that was more instinctive than conscious, sending the car lurching forward and away from the scene with a jolt of acceleration that scattered gravel across the shoulder and made the engine groan in protest. For several miles after passing that unsettling scene, I remained tightly wound, both hands gripping the wheel with white knuckles, heart thudding heavily in my chest as I kept glancing nervously between the empty stretch of road ahead and the rearview mirror behind me. I half expected a pair of headlights to appear suddenly, bearing down on me, confirming that what I had seen wasn't just strange, it was dangerous. But nothing ever showed. No cars, no movement, just mile after mile of darkness pressing in on both sides. So quiet that it made the entire event feel almost unreal, like I'd imagined it or dreamed it up during some micro-sleep I hadn't noticed slipping into. Eventually, I saw the soft glow of fluorescent lights on the horizon. And a short time later, I pulled into a quiet gas station on the outskirts of a small town. I didn't catch the name on the way in, and honestly, I didn't care. It wasn't a place I planned to stay. The building was one of those older, independent stations with faded signage and a few vending machines humming against the outside wall. I parked beneath the canopy and just sat there for a minute, letting the engine idle, trying to calm myself down, trying to convince myself that what had just happened was over. Inside, I spoke with the only person working the overnight shift, a middle-aged man behind the counter who looked like he'd seen his share of strange things. I described what I'd witnessed as clearly as I could. The car, the man waving away from it, the two others who appeared from the darkness. I didn't embellish anything, just stuck to what I saw and how it made me feel. He didn't look surprised. He didn't act concerned. He just listened, nodded slowly, and said he'd call the sheriff's office, like it was protocol. About 20 minutes later, a deputy showed up. He was professional and polite, not overly warm, but he took my statements seriously. He asked me for the exact location, what kind of car it was, what the people looked like, standard stuff. I answered as best I could, though some of the details were fuzzy from how quickly everything had happened. When I finished, he looked thoughtful for a second, then said quietly that other drivers had reported similar things on that same stretch of road. He didn't get into specifics, and I didn't ask. I think we both understood that there wasn't much more to say. By the time I got back on the road, the sky had just started to lighten in the east. I took the long way around to get back to the interstate. No shortcuts this time, no back roads. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't stop replaying the night in my head, over and over, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince myself I hadn't overreacted. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I've looked for that road again, on maps, through satellite images, even scrolling through message boards just to see if anyone else had posted something that matched what I saw. But nothing ever seems to line up. Maybe I missed a turn. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Or maybe it's just the kind of place that doesn't want to be found twice. Whatever the truth is, I didn't stop that night. And I've never second-guessed that decision. There's a kind of gut instinct that kicks in when something doesn't feel right. And ignoring it is usually how people end up in the kind of stories that don't end well. I was lucky, I know that. And while I don't tell this story to scare anyone, I do tell it to remind people that not everything that looks like a cry for help is what it seems. Some things don't want help. Some things are just waiting for the wrong kind of person to stop. And I wasn't that person, not that night, not on that road. It had been one of those stretched, numbingly quiet drives, the kind where time loses shape and distance begins to feel abstract, and where even your own thoughts seem to move at half their usual pace, drifting somewhere behind your focused stare at the endless stretch of empty road cutting through southern South Carolina. And by the time I realized how low the fuel gauge had dropped, I'd already passed too many exits to turn back, and had seen nothing ahead but pale highways, endless pine forests, and fading daylight that clung weakly to the horizon like the last breath of something dying. What began as a simple route southbound had turned into a slow slide into unfamiliar territory, with my GPS stuttering in and out of service before cutting out altogether. And as the reception dropped and the sun dipped below the trees, I found myself surrounded on all sides by the kind of rural emptiness that doesn't feel merely quiet, but completely unobserved. Like the land itself had forgotten what it meant to be lived in. And for a long stretch, I didn't pass a single vehicle, sign, or structure that showed any sign of movement or life. Eventually, as the last light bled from the sky and the shadows began to pull longer across the cracked pavement, I noticed a battered metal sign leaning dangerously to one side, almost swallowed by vines and brush. And though the paint had chipped so severely that most of the lettering had become indistinct, I could still make out the words gas and food barely clinging to the surface in sun-bleached white, along with a crooked arrow that pointed toward a narrow gravel road branching off into a darker wall of trees. I turned onto the path, more out of desperation than choice. And as I drove slowly along the uneven road, the thick woods on either side seemed to close in more tightly with each bend, their bare limbs clawing together overhead until the sky was all but obscured. And the only sound came from the crunch of tires over loose gravel and the occasional rustle of something unseen moving through the leaves beyond the tree line. After several tense minutes that felt far longer than they should have, the woods opened abruptly into a clearing where the gas station sat at the far end of the lot, half slouched beneath a collapsing canopy that leaned precariously to one side, its skeletal supports cracked and bowed under the weight of rust and rot. And the pumps beneath it looked like they hadn't been touched in a decade, their surfaces corroded and faded, with hoses coiled like limp, dried-out snakes and nozzles that either hung uselessly or had snapped off entirely. The building behind the pumps was low and flat, its windows caked in a thick film of grime that dulled the light trying to shine from inside. And though the flickering fluorescent bulb above the door gave the place a strange, twitching glow, it did little to ease the unnatural stillness that blanketed the lot like a suffocating veil, one that pressed in against the skin and made even the breath in my lungs feel unwelcome. I pulled the car in beside one of the more intact pumps, shut off the engine, and stepped out into the air that, despite the mild season, felt unnaturally cool and damp, almost metallic, as if it carried with it the residue of something long decayed and half forgotten. And though the pump had no visible out-of-order sign, the digital screen remained completely black no matter how many times I swiped my card, which only confirmed what my instincts had already begun to suspect, that nothing here worked as it should. Reluctantly, I turned toward the store, hoping that someone inside might still be operating the place in some unofficial way, perhaps taking cash or offering directions to the next working station. And as I approached the entrance, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar, not wide enough to be inviting. but just enough to suggest that the building had not been fully abandoned. At least, not in the usual sense. Stepping inside, I was met instantly with a wall of air that felt still and thick, not just humid, but heavy in a way that clung to the back of the throat and smelled faintly of mildew, old oil, and something far less identifiable but distinctly organic. And the interior of the store looked less like a functioning place of business and more like a preserved ruin, with warped shelving half-stocked with faded snack bags and soda bottles whose labels had curled from age and exposure, and coolers that stood dark and dead along the back wall, humming quietly as though mimicking life, but offering no real function. And then I saw him, the man standing behind the counter. He wasn't doing anything, not organizing the register, not reading a newspaper, not using a phone. He was simply standing there, rigid and silent, with an expression on his face that did not register as confused or curious or even neutral, but rather as eerily vacant, as though his eyes were open and pointed in my direction, but not actually seeing me. And his posture was so unnaturally straight and unmoving that for a moment I almost questioned whether he was real or simply a figure left behind, a kind of placeholder in an abandoned shell. Even though I hadn't yet spoken, and despite not making any noise aside from the door swinging shut behind me, his gaze never adjusted or flickered. And as I stood there at the threshold of that decaying station, I became increasingly aware of the sensation that I was not merely alone with this man, but somehow being watched through him, as though he was part of something else, something wider and more quietly malevolent. And then I saw them. Just behind the station, through the streaked glass of a side window, I noticed two figures emerging from the tree line, walking with a deliberate, steady pace across the gravel lot. One of them taller and broader, dressed in what looked like an oversized coat that dragged along his frame awkwardly, and the other shorter and hunched, his movements jerky and uneven, as if one leg had been injured long ago and never healed properly, causing his body to lurch in an almost rhythmic stutter with every step. The taller figure held something in his hand, long and metallic, which glinted briefly in the flickering light from the store's window. And although my initial instinct was to believe it might be a tool or a walking stick, it quickly became clear, through both shape and the way he carried it, that it was a crowbar, thick and rust-darkened, swinging lightly at his side with each deliberate stride, not gripped for labor, but held with the kind of casual tension that suggested purpose, as if he had used it before and fully intended to use it again. I turned back toward the man behind the counter, half expecting some reaction, some shift in expression, or even the faintest trace of alarm or awareness. But he remained exactly as he had been, still as a photograph, his gaze unfocused, his mouth closed, and his arms unmoved at his sides, as though the arrival of those figures was not an emergency, not even an event, but something expected, perhaps even scheduled. It was at that point that the fear took root, not in a sudden rush, not in a cinematic jolt of panic, but in a deep and quiet realization that I had entered a place where the rules of normal behavior had either collapsed or never applied in the first place. And I knew then with absolute clarity that I had to leave, not because I had enough information to justify the fear, but because everything around me was screaming with a silence too loud to ignore. I didn't speak, didn't confront, didn't even pretend to remain calm. I simply turned, walked out of the store as evenly as I could without breaking into a run, reached my car, got inside and locked the doors before starting the engine, with hands that had begun to tremble just enough to make the key miss the ignition twice. As I pulled away from the station and back down the gravel road, I didn't look back once. Not through the mirror, not through the rear view. Because some part of me, the oldest, most animal part of me, knew that to look back would be to invite something to follow, or worse, to see something I was not meant to survive remembering. I didn't let off the gas until the trees gave way to wider roads, until the narrow 2-lane split into 4, and the sound of passing cars filled the silence that had clung to me since leaving that lot. It was nearly an hour later when I finally pulled into a truck stop just off the interstate. A well-lit, modern place with fast food chains humming under fluorescent bulbs, rows of semis idling along the edges, and families filing in and out of the convenience store like nothing had ever gone wrong in the world. I stood there beside the pump longer than necessary, just breathing in the noise, the movement, the sheer banality of it all. It grounded me in a way I didn't realize I needed. A few days passed before I told anyone. I wasn't even sure how to bring it up without sounding unhinged or dramatic. But eventually, I mentioned it to someone I knew who had grown up in that part of South Carolina. I gave him a rough description: the old pumps, the collapsing canopy, the flickering light inside, and the way his expression changed. How he stopped chewing mid-bite and went completely still. Told me everything I needed to know before he even said a word. He didn't ask me to repeat it. He just nodded slowly, like someone who had heard a version of the story before, and finally said that the place I'd described had burned years ago. He couldn't recall exactly when, but he remembered it made the local news, and as far as he knew, it had never reopened. Still unsettled, I decided to verify it myself. I called the sheriff's office and asked about the property. The woman on the phone didn't hesitate. She confirmed it had been condemned since 2018, that the power lines had been pulled after the fire, and that the building hadn't had legal access to utilities in years. No businesses were registered to that address. No one had filed for renovations, permits, nothing. It wasn't just closed. It was legally dead. When I asked, carefully, whether there had ever been any reports of activity at the site, trespassers, squatters, unusual sightings, she paused for just a second too long before giving a neutral answer. She said there had been the occasional call, people claiming to see a light on or someone standing near the windows, but every time a deputy was dispatched to check it out, they found no footprints, no tire marks, no signs that anyone had been there recently. The building was always dark, always locked, and completely empty. She told me there was no reason to look into it further, that there was no case, no criminal activity, no real concern. But the way she said it, calm and well-rehearsed, left me with a distinct feeling that I wasn't the first person to call, and that whatever was happening out there wasn't something anyone wanted to get too close to. Since then, I've stopped trying to rationalize what I saw that night. Maybe it was just my nerves. Maybe there's a part of the brain that fills in the blanks when a place feels wrong. But one thing I can't shake, even now, months later, is the man behind the counter. The way he stood there, motionless, watching something I couldn't see. And the way those two figures emerged from the trees, like they knew exactly when I'd be there. I don't know what kind of place I stumbled into. I only know I wasn't supposed to find it. And I haven't taken a detour since. It was sometime in early 2021, during one of those early spring weeks when the air in Utah still carried the weight of winter, but the roads had begun to open up under clearer skies, that I decided to make the long, solitary overnight drive from Salt Lake City to Denver, motivated more by the desire for peace and efficiency than by necessity. I had always preferred traveling late at night, when the highways stretched out like quiet veins across the map, and the absence of other drivers gave me the illusion of being the only person left awake in the world, an illusion I had found oddly comforting on more than one occasion. By the time I approached the Utah-Colorado border, the dashboard clock confirmed that it was just a few minutes past 2 in the morning. And although I was still mentally present and in control behind the wheel, I could feel the creeping fatigue beginning to settle into my limbs. The kind of weariness that doesn't shout, but whispers softly, reminding you that you are not invincible, and that even a few minutes of rest or a quick walk could make all the difference between arriving safely and not arriving at all. As the highway unfurled in front of me with no other headlights visible in either direction, I saw the small blue sign announcing an upcoming rest area. And without hesitation, I took the next exit, turning off the main road and easing the vehicle down a narrow, paved lane that curved toward what appeared to be a bare-bones facility tucked up against the surrounding darkness. The place wasn't much to look at, even by rural standards. It consisted of a single, flat strip of asphalt, broken up by faded white lines, a short, low-slung concrete building that I assumed contained the restrooms, and a couple of crooked overhead lights mounted to aging poles, their glow barely pushing back against the enormous blackness of the desert beyond. There were no other vehicles in sight, and from the stillness of the lot, it seemed obvious that I was the only one who had passed through in quite some time. I turned off the engine but allowed the parking lights to remain on for a moment, bathing the front of the building in a dull amber hue that made the squat structure appear even more lonesome and forgotten. Stepping out of the car, I was immediately struck by how completely silent everything was. The kind of silence that feels manufactured rather than natural, as if the world had been paused rather than simply asleep. There was no wind brushing against the nearby scrub, no insects singing in the bushes, and not even the distant growl of a semi-truck cresting a far-off hill. The only sound came from my own movements, the steady crunch of my boots against the gravel as I walked across the lot, and the faint jingle of the car keys still clutched in my hand as I approached the entrance to the restroom. The building's overhead light buzzed faintly as it flickered once before stabilizing, and the door, made of a dented metal, groaned slightly when I pulled it open, revealing a cold interior bathed in the pale wash of a single humming fluorescent bulb. Inside, the air smelled of old concrete, rusted pipes, and the kind of institutional disinfectant that never fully masked the mustiness underneath. The floor was damp in places, probably the result of condensation forming on the cool surfaces. And the mirror above the stainless steel sink was already fogged with a thin layer of moisture, despite the absence of running water or steam. I stepped into the far stall out of habit, securing the latch behind me, and let the stillness of the space settle around me while I tried to shake the slight unease that was beginning to gather beneath my skin. It was only after a short moment, less than 2 minutes perhaps, that I heard the distinct metallic creak of the outer door being opened again, followed by the almost imperceptible shift of air pressure that occurs when someone else enters an enclosed room. I froze immediately, my senses sharpened by instinct, waiting to hear the expected sounds that should have followed. The measured footfalls of another person walking across the floor, the creak of a stall door being opened or closed, or perhaps the unmistakable splash of water running from the faucet. But none of those sounds came. There was nothing but the steady drone of the light overhead and the growing, almost suffocating silence that filled every corner of the room, pressing against me with a tension that felt entirely unnatural. I waited, holding my breath as I listened for anything. A cough, a shift of weight, even a breath. But the quiet remained absolute. And after what felt like an eternity measured in heartbeats, I slowly unlatched the stall door and stepped back out into the main area of the restroom. At first glance, everything appeared unchanged. The stalls were all open and empty, the sinks untouched, the air still unmoving. But when my eyes returned to the fogged mirror above the sink, I saw that something had changed, subtly but unmistakably. Written into the condensation, directly in the center of the mirror, were two words, "Nice car," scrawled in what appeared to be a deliberate, steady hand, as though whoever had written it had taken their time, ensuring the message would be legible and centered. It hadn't been there when I entered. Of that I was absolutely certain. I had glanced at the mirror casually on my way in, and the fog had been uniform across its surface with no visible writing or smudges. Whoever had entered while I was inside the stall had done so silently, written the message without making a sound, and left just as quietly, all without triggering the expected indicators of presence. No footsteps, no closing stall doors, no movement behind me in the mirror. The silence, once merely unsettling, now felt heavy with a new awareness, as though I had unknowingly invited someone into a space where they had no business being. Without hesitating further, I turned away from the mirror and made my way quickly but carefully back out through the metal door, half expecting to see someone standing in the lot, or perhaps disappearing behind one of the restroom's outer walls. But once again, the parking lot was empty, bathed in that dim, indifferent light, and surrounded on all sides by the endless dark of the desert. I took a few steps toward my vehicle, scanning the shadows with a growing sense of unease, until I reached the driver's side and noticed something small and out of place on the ground beside the door. Resting on the concrete, just inches from where my boot had stopped, was a single matchstick, slightly curved from heat exposure with a blackened tip and the faint, lingering scent of sulfur still clinging to the air around it. I don't smoke, and I hadn't handled anything flammable during the drive, which meant the match hadn't come from me. It had been placed or dropped recently, judging by the faint warmth still radiating from the wood when I cautiously picked it up. The doors of my car were still locked, and nothing appeared to have been disturbed. But the presence of that single, freshly used matchstick was enough to send a wave of cold, steady dread through me, because it was evidence not only that someone had been there, but that they had come close enough to stand beside my car while I was still inside that building, utterly unaware and completely vulnerable. I got back into the car with a deliberate calm, though my hands moved a little faster than usual as I pulled the door shut and locked it. I didn't bother glancing over my shoulder, and I didn't sit there trying to process what had just happened. I just started the engine, eased the car into drive, and let the headlights sweep across the empty lot one last time before I rolled back toward the highway. The air outside still looked still and harmless, but that didn't mean I was about to stick around to prove it. I merged back onto the road without hesitation, letting the lines of the highway pull me farther away from that rest stop, farther from the mirror, and from the match on the ground. I didn't think much during the rest of the drive, not in the way that leads to answers. My mind kept circling the same few details over and over. Too quiet, no sign of anyone. the message on the mirror, but none of it added up in a way that made sense. By the time the sun was coming up behind me and Denver came into view, I'd already decided I wasn't going to make a big deal out of it. I hadn't been threatened. Nothing had been stolen. It hadn't even escalated into something I could report. But it didn't sit right either. Not even close. A few days later, after I'd unpacked and the dust of the move had started to settle, I finally pulled up the dash cam footage. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe someone I missed, some shadow moving through the frame that would at least tell me I hadn't imagined it all. What I got instead was a timeline that looked like nothing had happened at all. My car pulled in, parked, sat there, and pulled out again. No one entered the frame. No other vehicles came or went. And the camera angle facing the building showed the restroom door remaining firmly shut the entire time. Not a single frame suggested anyone else had ever been there. I watched the segment twice. Slower the second time. Still nothing. Just me, alone in the dark, and a message that shouldn't have been there. I never called the authorities. There wasn't anything to report that would have made sense to someone who hadn't been there in the moment. No trespass, no damage, no confrontation. Just a feeling that someone had been much closer than I ever realized. Close enough to watch, close enough to act, but choosing not to. And that, somehow, was worse. I've stopped at a lot of rest areas over the years, but since that night, I've never been able to treat them the same way. Now, I leave the engine running. I keep the doors locked when I step out. I check the mirrors, not just the ones on the car, but the ones inside the buildings too. Always watching for signs that someone might have come in quietly, just out of frame. And sometimes, even when the mirror is clean, I still hesitate before turning my back to it. Because the part that stays with me isn't the message itself. It's the knowledge that someone had been standing there just long enough to leave it. And they made sure I knew they'd seen me, even if I never saw them. The stretch of highway I had been driving that day had gradually turned into an indistinct ribbon of faded asphalt, bordered by the kind of scenery that seemed to repeat itself no matter how many miles passed. Endless desert brush, sun-bleached signage for towns that barely existed anymore, and the distant outline of mesas that shimmered slightly in the suffocating dry heat as the afternoon wore on. With no fixed destination, and the monotony of the roads settling over me like a weighted blanket, I had made the decision to begin looking for a place to stop, only when my body began to protest the endless vibrations of the car seat, and my eyes had begun to feel grainy and overused, as if simply blinking required too much effort. By the time I passed the weather-beaten sign advertising a roadside motel with a flickering vacancy light, I'd long since stopped caring whether the place looked reputable, clean, or even occupied. It was there, and I needed to rest. The motel, which sat slightly off the main road behind a line of sparse, wind-bent trees and a gravel pull-in lot, looked like it had been forgotten by both time and tourists. Its single-story structure stretched in a crooked row beneath a faded, clay-tiled roof, and its windows were dark, unevenly shuttered with bent blinds that barely concealed the interiors. A rust-stained ice machine stood humming near the office entrance, accompanied by a vending machine that appeared to have been emptied years ago. Its interior shelves coated in dust and faded labels for snacks that no longer existed. There was only one vehicle in the parking area, a black pickup truck with windows so thoroughly tinted they appeared almost entirely opaque. And the way the tires had sunk slightly into the gravel suggested that it hadn't been moved in quite some time, possibly not even within the last month. The entire property exuded a kind of stagnant silence, not the peace of isolation, but the dull stillness of abandonment. When I entered the lobby, the temperature barely shifted, and the air smelled like something between disinfectant and old carpet. An odor that spoke more to neglect than cleanliness, as though efforts had been made to cover over age rather than address it. The counter at the front desk was worn smooth in places, and the bulletin board beside it held a collection of yellowed notices and curled pamphlets advertising local attractions that may have closed years ago. No one was immediately visible behind the desk, and I stood there in the shallow quiet for a full minute before a man finally emerged from a back room. His step slow and deliberate, as though he had either just awoken or had been waiting, unmoving in silence before deciding to appear. He looked like he could have been anywhere between 35 and 50, with tired features that carried no real expression beyond a bland neutrality that bordered on indifference. He wore a plaid flannel shirt faded from many washes, and a crooked plastic name tag that had been scratched to the point that whatever name had once been printed on it was now unreadable. His eyes met mine only briefly before drifting past, not in avoidance, but with a kind of practiced detachment, as if direct human connection had become a formality rather than something meaningful. I handed him my license and card, which he processed without a word, and then he slid a single room key across the counter, an actual metal key attached to a green plastic tag embossed with the number 6. Without offering any accompanying information, no mention of amenities, no warnings, and not even the expected perfunctory welcome or instruction about checkout time. His silence was not hostile, merely mechanical, like someone following a script they no longer bothered to speak aloud. I accepted the key and stepped back out into the darkening evening, now fully aware of the heavy quiet that surrounded the building. A silence only occasionally broken by the far-off rush of wind scraping across the parking lot and making the rusted signage sway slightly with a strained creak. Room 6 was located a short distance down the row, near an overflowing dumpster enclosure that carried a foul undertone of rotting paper and what might have been moldy fabric, and the bulb above the doorway buzzed intermittently, casting a sickly orange light that flickered just enough to make the shadows look like they were moving. As I approached, I noticed that the doorknob to the room didn't turn freely when I inserted the key. It resisted, subtly but noticeably, as though something on the other side had pressed against it, or the mechanism itself was reluctant to let me in. When the door finally opened, what greeted me was not the emptiness I had expected from a freshly assigned motel room, but the unmistakable atmosphere of a space that was currently or had very recently been inhabited by someone else. Even before my eyes adjusted fully to the low light, I could discern the soft, muted glow from the bathroom inside, its door partially ajar, the light left on, and just beyond that, the vague silhouettes of personal belongings that confirmed my growing sense of discomfort. A pair of heavy boots sat neatly aligned beside the bed, their surfaces scuffed and dust-covered in a way that suggested regular use, not a careless abandonment. A half-empty bottle of water rested on the nightstand, its plastic sides still faintly beaded with condensation. And next to it lay a crumpled receipt or scrap of paper I could not clearly make out. In the corner, just past the foot of the bed, was a black duffel bag leaning against the upholstered chair, its zipper half open and clothing partially visible inside. I saw no movement. I heard no sound. but everything about the room screamed of recent presence. Someone had been here, and there was no logical reason why I should have been given access to it. I closed the door slowly, careful not to make noise, and stood outside for a moment with the key still in hand, unsure whether I should knock, leave, or return to the office. Eventually, driven by the same fatigue that had brought me here in the first place, I turned back toward the front desk, entered the lobby once again, and informed the clerk, who was still standing in the same place with the same unreadable expression, that the room was clearly not unoccupied. His response was as mechanical as his earlier interaction. Without looking up or asking questions, he simply reached below the desk, retrieved another key, and handed it to me in the exact same way as before. This time the number read 11. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the mistake, and nothing in his manner suggested that what had just occurred was at all unusual or deserving of explanation. Room 11, located closer to the far edge of the property, sat beneath a non-functioning exterior light, and the area around it felt even more secluded, the shadows thicker, the silence more complete. I approached with caution, but this door opened smoothly, and when I stepped inside, the room appeared properly unoccupied. There were no personal items, no half-finished drinks, no strange scents lingering in the air. The sheets were neatly made, the surfaces bare, and the bathroom dark and dry. Still uneasy, I locked the door immediately, fastened the deadbolt, and slid the metal chain across with deliberate care. I checked behind the curtains, opened the closet, peered into the bathroom, and ran the water briefly just to confirm that I was truly alone. Satisfied, or at least not unconvinced, I turned on the aging air conditioning unit built into the wall beneath the window and let it sputter to life, pushing out air that carried the sharp tang of rust and dust. Although I did eventually lay back on the bed and close my eyes, any hope of real rest was quickly undermined by the kind of pervasive silence that doesn't soothe but instead sharpens every little sound into something worth noticing. The room didn't feel empty, exactly. It felt paused, as if it was waiting for something, and my thoughts kept looping back to the first room I'd been given. I couldn't stop imagining those boots positioned so neatly by the bed, or the half-zipped duffel bag sitting open in the corner, its contents unsettled, as if someone had been interrupted mid-routine and intended to return at any moment. That image stayed with me, heavy and unshakable, like something I'd seen just before a mistake. At some point in the middle of the night, I came out of sleep all at once, not because of any specific noise, but because of a full-body certainty that something had changed in the room while I was unconscious. I opened my eyes to find the digital clock casting its faint red glow on the wall, the digits showing 3:02 a.m., a same, and I realized then that the air conditioner had gone completely silent. It wasn't just off. It was dead in the way machines go when their circuits stop carrying current altogether. The absence of that constant drone made the room feel unnatural, like it had been removed from normal time. Still lying flat, I shifted just enough to prop myself on one elbow, my ears straining for any hint of movement. And that was when I heard it, the sound of the doorknob turning. It wasn't aggressive or panicked. Whoever was on the other side of the door was moving with eerie precision, like they had practiced the motion before. The handle turned all the way, but the bolt I'd set held firm. And after a moment's pause, the knob eased itself back into place with a slow, metallic click that sounded far too deliberate to be a mistake. A few seconds later, there came a knock. It sounded like the kind of knock someone gives when they already know what's inside and are waiting to see if it responds. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I stayed completely still in that narrow slice of bed where the mattress creaked the least and let the seconds crawl past me, one at a time, while my chest rose and fell in shallow, controlled breaths. No second knock followed. No voice, no footsteps fading away. There was only silence. Deep, wide, unnatural silence that seemed to stretch out on the other side of the door like a held breath. I stayed frozen that way until the first trace of light began bleeding in at the edge of the curtains, coloring the walls a faint gray blue and reminding me that the world still turned, even in places like this. When it felt safe enough to move, I got dressed in silence, packed my bag without disturbing anything else in the room, and made my way back to the office. The man at the front desk was still there, standing exactly as he had been the night before, with no indication that he'd ever moved. He handed me my printed receipt without any eye contact, and I had almost reached the door when he spoke in a low, flat voice that seemed less like a statement and more like a rule being recited from memory. He said it was better not to open the wrong door around here. His eyes never left the monitor in front of him, and he offered no further explanation. I didn't ask him to clarify. I didn't try to play it off or make sense of what he'd said. I simply nodded without thinking and stepped back outside into the chill of early morning, where the air already carried that dry desert heat waiting just below the horizon. I got into my car, turned the ignition, and pulled out of that gravel lot without even glancing at the rear-view mirror until I was halfway back to the main road. I didn't file a complaint with the motel. I didn't leave a review online. I never even checked my bank statement to see if I'd been charged for both rooms. I knew from the moment I left that nothing I could have reported would have changed anything. And I also knew, with a kind of bone-deep certainty, that whatever had been behind that knock hadn't been looking for customer service satisfaction. Since then, I've passed plenty of roadside motels in states just like Arizona, and I've never once been tempted to pull in for the night. I book ahead now. I stay in places with well-lit parking lots and 24-hour lobbies and security cameras that actually work. And even now, years later, when I remember that single, uninvited knock at 3:02 a.m., I still find myself wondering, not who was on the other side of the door, but who they thought was supposed to answer. It was during the late weeks of autumn in 2022 that I found myself driving alone along a long, desolate stretch of mountainous highway deep in central Idaho. A route I had taken before, though never at this hour, and never with the particular sense of stillness that hung over the landscape that night. The time had passed well beyond 11, and the sky, completely absent of any moonlight, had turned an ink-black shade that seemed to press down against the tops of the pine trees that lined both sides of the road in dense, silent formation. There were no other vehicles in sight, not even distant headlights or the occasional hum of tires cresting a hill far behind me. It was simply me, the twisting road ahead, and the soft mechanical rhythm of my car as it climbed gently into the higher elevations, where cell reception faded entirely and the forest grew even thicker. The experience had, at first, a certain peacefulness to it, a rare kind of solitude that, while quiet, didn't yet feel unnatural. My headlights illuminated only what was immediately ahead, And beyond that small cone of light, everything dissolved into darkness so complete that the edges of the world felt undefined. After some time, however, that tranquility began to shift. And it was shortly after I rounded a bend near a steep incline that I caught sight of a pair of headlights behind me. Two pale orbs cutting through the dark, growing larger with each passing minute. Initially, I assumed it was simply another late-night traveler trying to make it through the mountains before the early frost made the roads more treacherous. But as the vehicle behind me began to close the distance at an unusually persistent pace, I started to feel something I couldn't quite name at first. Something that began, perhaps, as mild irritation, but slowly deepened into a quiet unease. The vehicle remained uncomfortably close to my rear bumper, far too close for the kind of road we were on. And it never once dimmed its high beams, even though my mirrors reflected the harsh white glare directly back at whoever, or whatever, was inside. I attempted to speed up just slightly, thinking that if I increased my pace, they might have enough room to either pass or fall back. But the car behind me matched my every move with unnatural precision, its headlights steady and unwavering, the distance between us never changing by more than a few feet. Every time I glanced up into the mirror, I could see nothing beyond the intense brightness. Not the make of the vehicle, not the silhouette of a driver, not even a hint of movement. Just two unwavering beams of light, and the inescapable feeling that they were locked onto me. After several miles of this, I noticed an upcoming turnout. A rough gravel pull-off built into the side of the mountain, typically used by slower vehicles to allow others to pass. And without giving myself time to second-guess the decision, I signaled and eased onto the gravel shoulder, the sound of the tires crunching beneath me, briefly breaking the monotony of engine hum and wind. I slowed to a complete stop, angled slightly forward, and waited for the trailing car to overtake me and continue on its way. But it didn't. Instead, the vehicle pulled in directly behind me, matching my maneuver almost identically, and came to a stop no more than 10 or 15 feet away, its headlights still on, shining directly through the rear window of my car with the same cold intensity as before. I sat motionless for several seconds, my foot on the brake, my heart now beating more quickly than I was comfortable admitting to myself. And I waited for something, anything, to happen. For a door to open, for someone to get out, for the lights to blink or shift or react in any way that would suggest a normal human presence behind the wheel. But the vehicle remained completely still. After nearly a full minute of silence, during which I debated whether to drive away or confront the situation directly, I reluctantly shut off the engine, opened the driver's side door, and stepped out into the cold mountain air, which felt even colder now with the tension tightening around me like a rope. The only sound was that of the gravel under my boots as I slowly made my way toward the other car, each step deliberate, cautious, and filled with a rising discomfort that made my skin prickle despite the chill. As I approached, I began to notice things that struck me as deeply strange. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but in the kind of quiet, detail-specific way that you only register when your senses are heightened and your instincts are telling you something is wrong. The car appeared to be entirely dark on the inside, as though it were completely powered down. There were no dashboard lights, no faint glow of a phone screen, no motion within, no outline of a person sitting in the driver's seat. Just the glare of the headlights and the unsettling stillness of the vehicle itself. Then, just as I reached the point where I might have been able to look through the windshield, the headlights turned off. Not with a flicker, not with the delay you sometimes get when automatic lights shut down, but all at once, in a complete and immediate blackout, as though the power had been cut or the entire car had blinked out of awareness. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that seems to swallow even your breathing. And I stood there in the dark, surrounded by towering trees and the weight of the night, staring at a vehicle that now felt entirely lifeless. I took a step backward, then another, before finally turning and making my way quickly, but not yet running, back to my own car, where I got in, locked the doors without hesitation, and twisted around to look behind me through the rear window. The car was no longer there. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again, twice, just to be sure. But the turnout behind me, faintly lit now by the red glow of my reverse lights, was completely empty. There was no sound of an engine idling or pulling away, no taillights fading into the dark curves of the highway, no gravel being disturbed. Nothing. Just that quiet, open patch of shoulder and the pitch-black forest crowding in behind it like it had swallowed whatever had been there a moment earlier. I sat there frozen for a few seconds, trying to make sense of what I wasn't seeing. My heart was still racing. And even though I was trying to come up with some kind of logical explanation, anything to keep myself from completely losing it, nothing really held together in my head. Eventually, I turned my car back on and pulled away, scanning the mirrors more than I probably should have, half expecting those same lights to suddenly reappear behind me, bearing down from out of nowhere. I didn't see another vehicle for the rest of the drive. By the time I rolled into town, the sky was starting to pale, with that early morning haze creeping over the treetops. I should have felt relieved, finally being back around houses, streetlights, and gas stations. But I didn't. The feeling in my chest, the tight, unsettled weight of what I'd seen back there, was still pressing down just as hard as it had on that dark stretch of road. Later that morning, I went back out there with a friend. I didn't tell him everything, just that something weird had happened, and I wanted another pair of eyes to help make sense of it. He mostly humored me, but I could tell he didn't really buy into any of it. We checked the turnout top to bottom. My tire tracks were clear as day, but there wasn't any sign of a second set. No tread pattern, no indentations, no displaced gravel. Nothing to suggest another car had pulled off or driven away. It was like my vehicle had been the only one there all along. I thought about reporting it. I even pulled up the non-emergency number for the local sheriff's office once or twice. But in the end, I didn't make the call. I couldn't picture myself explaining it without sounding like I'd just lost my grip on reality. What would I even say? That I was followed by a car that didn't have a driver, and that it vanished without a sound or a trace. I already knew how that would go. Over the next few weeks, I replayed the whole thing in my head more times than I can count. I tried every explanation I could come up with. Maybe I'd been overtired. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe I'd misjudged the angles or the road layout and just imagined more than what was there. But no matter how I spun it, there were too many things that didn't add up. The precision with which that car matched my speed and turns, the intensity of its headlights, the way it just sat there without a sound, and then vanished completely, leaving nothing behind. None of that fits inside any normal explanation I've ever heard. I don't talk about it much, mostly because I know how it sounds. It's one of those things you keep to yourself unless you're sure the person listening won't look at you like you've completely lost it. Still, even now, months later, if I'm driving on a remote road at night, especially in the woods or the mountains, I catch myself checking the mirrors more often than I used to. And every so often, just for a second, I find myself bracing to see those same high beams locked on me again, closer than they should be, like they never really left.